A monster. Australia's most hated woman. Worst serial killer. These are the names given to a mother suspected of killing her 4 children by smothering them, allegedly. When after 20 years, science and technology proved that there may be a natural cause, medical explanation to these children's deaths, it came as a shock. It took almost 2 decades and numerous experts and their research to convince the court that Kathleen Folbigg, once Australia's most hated woman, may be the victim of one of the worst miscarriages of justice. In today's video, let's look at the case that shook Australia. Kathleen Megan Folbigg, née Donovan, was born on 14th June 1967. When she was just 2 years old, her father, Thomas John Britton, murdered her mother by stabbing her 24 times. Following his arrest and subsequent deportation from the country, Kathleen became an orphan and, as a result, ward of the state. She was placed in the care of a local couple when she was just 3 years old. That didn't last long. On 18th July 1970, Folbigg was removed from the couple's care and moved into Bidura Children's Home. By September that year, she was moved into the home of Marlboroughs as the foster child. They were also interested in adopting her later. It is believed that while at their house, she was treated more like a slave than a loved child. She was not allowed to make friends or have much interaction with the children her own age. Kathleen was not told of her mother's murder by her father until 1984. In fact, she had always assumed that she had always been a ward of the state and was adopted by Marlboroughs. A day before her 16th birthday, her adoptive parents sat her down and told her that her father was a murderer and he had murdered her mother. This shattered any misgivings she might have had about her parents ever loving her or that they had adopted her because they wanted her in their lives. The callousness in informing her of her heritage as a murderer's daughter caused her immense pain at the time. It also made it clear that her foster family never accepted her as their child. At the same time, she finally understood why they treated her like a slave. Thereafter, Kathleen Folbigg struggled to stay in school. She somehow managed to complete her trial HSC in 1985 until life at home became unbearable and she was forced to leave home and school. She left school and worked in a series of dead-end jobs. When she was 20 years old, she met Craig Folbigg. He was 25 at the time. The pair formed a relationship and bought a home in northwestern Newcastle, New South Wales suburb of Mayfield, in May 1987. They married in September that same year. For a while, everything seemed fine. She finally had a home of her own, a life of her own. Maybe for the first time in her life, she felt like she had some control over her own destiny. Then, not long after they married, the couple had their first child. Caleb Gibson Folbigg was born a healthy boy on 1st February 1989. One day, while feeding him, Kathleen noticed that Caleb was struggling to breathe. They took him to the hospital and he was diagnosed with a mild case of laryngomalacia. Laryngomalacia is a common cause of noisy breathing in infants. It happens when a baby's larynx or voice box is soft and floppy, something doctors assured the parents he would eventually outgrow. But on 20th February 1989, Kathleen put Caleb to sleep. His room was located right next to the master bedroom. During the night, Caleb was restless and Kathleen reportedly attempted to soothe him. Around 2:50 a.m. that morning, Craig Folbigg was woken up by his wife's screams. He ran into his son's room and saw Kathleen standing over the crib screaming, "My baby, something is wrong with my baby." Caleb was not breathing. In the end, they were told he died of sudden infant death syndrome. He was just 20 days old. 7 months later, Kathleen became pregnant again and gave birth to a couple's second child in June 1990. Patrick Allen Folbigg was born on 3rd June 1990. Craig Folbigg remained at home to help care for his wife and new baby for the first 3 months after the birth. On October 18, 1990, Kathleen put Patrick to bed. Craig looked on him around 10 p.m. and the child appeared to be sleeping peacefully. At around 3:30 a.m. next morning, Craig was again woken up by Kathleen's screams. When he rushed to his son's room, Kathleen was standing over Patrick's crib, looking down on the motionless baby lying in the crib. Craig picked up the baby and performed CPR till the ambulance arrived. They took him to the hospital. Even though baby Patrick survived, he was diagnosed with epilepsy and as a result of severe seizures, blindness. On the morning of February 13, 1991, Craig was at work when he got a call from Kathleen. She reportedly told him it has happened again. Craig left work and arrived home just in time as the ambulance arrived to take Patrick to the hospital. But this time, they couldn't save him. He was pronounced dead on arrival. An autopsy was conducted and the cause of death was an acute asphyxiating event resulting from an epileptic fit. After the loss of Patrick, the couple moved to Thornton, a town northwest of Newcastle, New South Wales. The third child, Sarah, was born in October 1992. Everything seemed fine for the next few months. Sarah seemed to be a happy baby. When she was 11 months old, she caught a cold, as children often do. It was not considered anything serious. By 1:30 a.m. the next morning, Sarah had passed. This time, Craig was woken up again by Kathleen's screams just like the last 2 times. She was in the doorway that led to Sarah's room. When Craig entered, he saw that Sarah was motionless on the bed. Same routine as before followed. Ambulance was called, and the subsequent autopsy didn't reveal any particular cause of death. It was again attributed to sudden infant death syndrome. After this tragedy, the couple moved again. Their second daughter and fourth child was born on 7th August 1977, Laura Elizabeth Folbigg. Laura was by all accounts a healthy baby. Unlike her siblings, Laura's breathing and sleep patterns were monitored closely for several weeks after her birth, just to be sure. All was well for the next year and a half almost. When Laura was 19 months, one day she woke up with cold-like symptoms. Kathleen gave her medication, but at around 12 p.m. on March 1, 1999, she called an ambulance after Laura allegedly stopped breathing. According to the official report, 2 ambulance officers arrived to find Kathleen performing CPR on her daughter on the breakfast bar. They examined Laura and found that she was not breathing and had no pulse. As before, an autopsy was conducted, but unlike the others, the coroners considered Laura too old to have sudden infant death syndrome. Even though the suspected cause was myocarditis, once they realized this was the 4th death in the family, they recorded her cause of death as undetermined and ordered a police investigation. Detective Sergeant Bernard Ryan was assigned to investigate Laura Folbigg's death. Babies' deaths are very sensitive in general. So when handling a case like this, it is very important that the officers keep their emotions separate and don't let them get in the way, especially when the primary suspect is a said child's mother. Initially, he did not know that Laura was couple's 4th child to die under suspicious circumstances. One of the most important quote-unquote clues in this case was when after their 4th child died, Kathleen and her husband separated, and reportedly when Kathleen moved, she left behind a lot of her personal belongings. And on one occasion, her now ex-husband found her personal diaries. When he went through them, he found some of the entries where she admits to feeling guilty and other very personal feelings. He handed them over to the police and expressed his suspicion that their children's deaths may not have been an accident or sudden infant death syndromes, that she might have actually harmed them intentionally. I have read some of the entries that are publicly available. It is clear that Kathleen was tormented. She had carried a lot of childhood trauma, of abandonment from her birth parents, and abuse and neglect from her foster parents. On one occasion, she writes, 30 years. The first 5 I don't really remember. The rest I choose not to remember. The last 10 to 11 have been filled with trauma, tragedy, happiness, and mixed emotions of all designs. If it wasn't for my baby coming soon, I'd sit and wonder again what I was put on this earth for. What contribution have I made to anyone's life? This clearly shows she was struggling with self-worth to come to terms with what her purpose in life really was. On another occasion, she writes, why is family so important to me? I now have the start of my very own, but it doesn't seem good enough. I know Craig doesn't understand. He has the knowledge and stability and love from his siblings and parents, even if he chooses to ignore them. Me, I have no one but him. It seems to affect me so. Why should it matter? It shouldn't. It is apparent that she still carried all that trauma. In addition to that, it felt like with each child, Kathleen and Craig's relationship deteriorated. She mentions on more than one occasion that he would tease her about her weight gain after the pregnancies, so she felt a lot of pressure to get back in shape as soon as possible. It is not clear if she had ever voiced these thoughts to him or not, but she took these comments to mean that she was not attractive to him if she was a little overweight. Whether it was her own insecurities or Craig really was insensitive, it is hard to say. Maybe it's a bit of both. It was also apparent that she obviously loved her children, but she also feared that she was going to fail them, that they would abandon her like her parents did when she was a child, especially after the death of her first child. She feared she would now be abandoned by her children. How she now had a family, but she never felt like she was a part of it. She sometimes felt like an outsider, maybe an imposter in her own home. She also expressed moments of rage, resentment, and hatred towards her children at times. It was easy to see that she was depressed and had very little control over her changing emotions. She wrote in her diary, "My brain has too much happening. Unstored and unrecalled memories just waiting. Heaven help the day they surface and I recall. That will be the day to lock me up and throw away the key. Something I'm sure will happen one day." Some entries spoke specifically about her treatment of her children. She writes, "I feel like the worst mother on this earth, scared that she, meaning Laura, will leave me now, like Sarah did. I knew I was short-tempered and cruel sometimes to her, and she left with a bit of help." There is not a full-on confession anywhere, just mentions of guilt for not being able to protect her children. Some of them could have been seen as confessions in hindsight, or could be something as simple as mom guilt. It is very hard to decipher through these entries if she had done the unthinkable or not, at least to me. But her ex-husband Craig was convinced that she had in fact harmed their children. I also feel for him. Imagine being woken up in the middle of the night and having to face the nightmare of losing a child over and over. It might have been, for him, like a recurring nightmare that wouldn't end. And in all of them, he had one common element: his wife standing over the crib, letting out a gut-wrenching scream. Anyone in his situation would probably blame that one person who was the last to see their children alive. Kathleen Folbigg's behavior after each death, what her husband Craig later termed as broken sparrow routine, according to him, was theatrical. He would wake to his wife's blood-curdling screams, her standing over the crib. After the deaths of the first 3 children, Kathleen packed all their belongings away, taking photos out of the frames and off the mantelpiece. She would not mention their names again. All this, combined with her diary entries leading up to each death, convinced Craig that she had killed them. He also recalled that she would at times get angry and quite violent at the children, where an unbiased outsider would see an exhausted, sleep-deprived, emotional mother. Craig saw an uncaring, neglectful, at times cruel woman. She was arrested and charged with murder of all 4 of her children. During her trial, her husband Craig became prosecution's main witness. She herself has always denied all the charges against her. All of the evidence against Kathleen Folbigg was circumstantial. They were not able to confirm with certainty that the children's deaths could have been attributed to suffocation, which was what they were going for. That the deaths were not natural. Kathleen had suffocated and killed all 4 of her children. Since there was not enough medical evidence to prove that such was the case, there was always a gray area around her conviction. How was it possible that she had killed 4 children by smothering them without leaving any physical evidence or any apparent sign of being smothered to death? Kathleen was tried and convicted for the murder of 3 of her children and manslaughter of her firstborn Caleb in May 2003. At the time of the trial, the jury was told that there was no other case in the entire world at the time where multiple children of the same parents had all died of natural causes. But what they failed to tell the jury was even at the time, there were 8 other families in the world where a family had lost multiple children due to a rare genetic mutation. As a result, Kathleen Folbigg was labeled Australia's worst female serial killer and most hated woman and sentenced to 40 years in prison. That sentence later was reduced on appeal to a 25-year non-parole period. Throughout her trial and subsequent conviction, Kathleen Folbigg maintained her innocence. A lot of experts gave their perspective as to why she might have done it. Her father, being a murderer, played a large part in people's perception of her, and some were even convinced that she was her father's daughter, meaning, since he was a murderer, she was, by relation, predisposed to committing murder herself. Kathleen's legal team, as well as her friends, who knew her since childhood days, stood by her. They were also a big reason Kathleen could keep the fight to prove her innocence alive. Kathleen Folbigg's 2003 trial was also strongly influenced by the since discredited Meadows law, referring to a controversial pediatrician Roy Meadow. The law suggested that 3 or more sudden infant deaths in one family was murder until proven otherwise. Kathleen and her team tried to appeal unsuccessfully for many years. Even after several research papers and expert scientists tried to convince the court that her case needed an investigation in light of a rare genetic mutation they found in Kathleen and her 2 deceased daughters. In 2018, a petition raising doubts over some of the evidence presented at trial led the New South Wales Attorney General to announce the first of 2 inquiries into Kathleen Folbigg's convictions. As part of that inquiry, which ended in 2019, genomes of Folbigg's 4 children were sequenced, revealing Kathleen Folbigg and her 2 daughters, Sarah and Laura, shared a new variant of a gene known as COM2. Other mutations in this gene had previously been associated with cardiac abnormalities that caused sudden death in infants and children. But experts weren't able to confirm the likely effect of the gene variant in Kathleen Folbigg's daughters before the inquiry finished in 2019. In November 2020, an international team of scientists published a research paper concluding that the variant Folbigg and her daughters possessed in the COM2 gene was likely to result in life-threatening cardiac arrhythmias. A fatal arrhythmic event may have been triggered by their intercurrent infections, meaning the cold-like symptoms or respiratory infections both Laura and Sarah had developed a few days before their deaths might have triggered a cardiac arrhythmias, causing their little hearts to stop suddenly. The team also identified that the 2 boys, Caleb and Patrick, carried variants in a gene known as BSN, a gene shown to cause early onset lethal epilepsy. Patrick had suffered from epileptic seizures. A research paper that came out in 2022 identified BSN variants in 5 unrelated people with epilepsy. The researchers identified biallelic variants which the two Folbigg boys had were associated with severe epilepsy with neurodevelopmental delay, which could cause fatal epilepsy. The inquiry also heard psychological and psychiatric expert interpretations of Kathleen Folbigg's diary entries, which concluded that they were expressions of a grieving mother and did not contain clear admissions of criminal guilt. As a result of these revelations, Director of Public Prosecutions of New South Wales ultimately accepted the new evidence gives rise to reasonable doubt regarding Kathleen Folbigg's guilt. The summary findings prepared by Kathleen's team relayed to the Attorney General detailed that helped him reach a firm view that there was reasonable doubt as to the guilt of Miss Folbigg for each of the offences for which she was originally tried. This led to New South Wales Attorney General Michael Daly immediately recommending to the New South Wales Governor General that Folbigg should be unconditionally pardoned and released immediately. Kathleen Folbigg was released from Clarence Correctional Centre on 5th June 2023 after serving 20 years. While he did not comment on whether he believed Kathleen Folbigg was innocent or not, Daly noted, "We have got 4 little children who are dead. We have a husband and wife who lost each other, a woman who spent 20 years in jail, and a family that never had a chance. You'd not be human if you don't feel something about that." Which is exactly what I feel on this matter. I know both her conviction and later acquittal or pardon, whatever one may choose to call it, will have polarizing opinions from the general public. There are those who believe that she was innocent to begin with, that her conviction was the biggest miscarriage of justice in Australia's history. She was judged and held to impossible standards just because she was a woman and a mother, so should have behaved a certain way. Since she didn't, she must be guilty. There are another set of people who believe that she got off easy. There is no way she was completely innocent. No amount of scientific findings will ever convince them that she didn't harm any of her children, her husband being one of them. But one thing none of us can ignore is a fact that Kathleen Folbigg was clearly troubled and in need of help. She didn't have access to therapy, so she used her diary as a way to voice her feelings, her innermost tormented thoughts, her worries and troubles, and these were used against her. She had no way of defending herself when pitted against what she herself had penned in her most vulnerable moments. As one expert suggested, she had written pages and pages of mundane things about her life in general. Among those pages, when you read a few that take some of what she wrote out of context, it did look like confessions of a guilty mind. Even in her release, I cannot say if she was truly happy. Relieved, yes, from the burden of being called the most hated woman in Australia, being called a baby killer, worst mother ever, a monster. But ultimately, she lost all her children under tragic circumstances. She lost her marriage and most of all, the dream of having a life, family of her own, like the one she never had growing up. If you made it to the end with me, what do you think about today's video? Do you believe in her innocence? Let me know in the comments below. As always, like, share and subscribe. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your support. Until next time.